Thank you for tuning in to Cricket and Cocktails. We'll get to the cocktail later, but first, let's talk about cricket. My name is Ben Feasy, and this is my Ashes series preview podcast. In this series, we have an outstanding, experienced, but nonetheless ageing Australian side facing off against a younger, confident England team, albeit a team dominated by players with little or no experience of Test cricket in Australian conditions. The most experienced players in the England squad, Captain Ben Stokes and the senior batter Joe Root, have both been talked down in the Australian media. Joe Root is one of the leading run scorers of all time, but, as we know, he has never scored 100 in Australia in his 14 Test matches there to date, so he is dismissed as Average Joe. Ben Stokes has scored a century in Australia, and in his case the national press are questioning his temperament, labelling him Baz Ball, that's spelt B-A-W-L, so the label is nothing to do with Baz Ball, B-A-Z-B-A-L-L, which refers of course to England's aggressive style of play under Captain Ben Stokes and team coach Brendan McCullum. The England journalists in turn have looked at the Australian squad, which has only one player under the age of 30, and they've used the strapline Dad's Army. Usman Khawaja, aged 38, and the great Steve Smith, aged 36, will both bat in Australia's top six and face a battery of England bowlers, all capable of bowling at 90 miles an hour, and in the case of a fully fit Mark Wood and Jofra Archer, quicker than that. So how will Australia cope with an England attack that is reportedly the most hostile England have sent to Australia since the 1970s? How will Australia's bowling attack, dominated by players in their mid-30s, get through 5 Test matches in just under 7 weeks? You can ask the same of England. 5 Test matches in just under 7 weeks is a very demanding workload, and there has to be a risk of injuries. We already know Australian bowler and captain Pat Cummins will miss the first game due to a back injury, and there are also hamstring concerns for Josh Hazlewood. I will discuss these key issues and others with my good friend, fellow fan, writer and former cricket producer, Alan Bone. Welcome to my first Ashes podcast. This is the Ashes preview podcast. The series title is Cricket and Cocktails. I'll get to the cocktail later, so we don't need to worry about that just now. First of all, I'll introduce myself. My name's Ben Feasy. I love cricket. I can't play it to any great standard, but I've had the privilege of writing about it, commentating about it, and announcing about it for almost 20 years. And my guest, Alan Bone, is himself a cricket writer and a cricket producer. And we're going to take you through what we believe are going to be key elements in deciding this Ashes series. So, Alan, thank you for joining me.
Good morning, Ben. How are you? How are you doing?
I'm all right. Yes, there's a little bit of an injury concern to Josh Hazlewood, but apparently he's going to be okay. He pulled up a little bit tight in the hamstring department in his last Sheffield Shield game.
This is what happens when you have bowlers who are. I think I saw a description Henry Blofeld gave of these guys last year, and it was something a lot about advanced middle age or something like that in sort of fast bowling terms. So they're a lot younger than you or I, but
Yes.
it's quite depressing when you hear people in their early 30s being described as in advanced middle age. But
oh God, yes. I mean, I've heard players as young as 32 saying, "Oh, I'm 32 now, and it's harder to get the body into shape. I'm 48. God, what hope do I have?" The English media jibe, and I'm sure you'd agree with this, appears to be Dad's Army, as you said yourself. And the Australian media jibe tends to start with the captain. That's the Australian way. So Ben Stokes is Baz Ball, spelt B-A-W-L, because apparently he's a serial complainer. And Joe Root, England's leading run scorer in Test history, one of the highest of all time, is Average Joe because
Average Joe, absolutely. And yeah. Stokes, they always put the New Zealand-born Ben Stokes as well, just to sort of rub that in. It's good fun and games. It's what we've had kind of following the game, I guess, for a quarter of a century, or God, that's depressing, isn't it? Well, quite a long time anyway.
Let's go with the visitors first. I think that's only polite. So the strategy appears to be to have selected bowlers on pace, ability to bowl consistently mid to high 80s, or in the case of Mark Wood and Jofra Archer, beyond. And it's reputedly, in that department, the most hostile England bowling attack that's been picked since the 1970s, when you had a young Bob Willis and John Snow leading the bowling attack. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the one time that, well, actually, England have only won the Ashes twice since that 70-71 tour. There was 86-87 under Gatting, and we didn't really have bowlers of any great pace then. In fact, both of them by the time we got to Melbourne was bowling at about my pace, really. He having had an injury, and similarly 2010-11, where you had obviously high quality bowlers with Jimmy Anderson leading the attack, but not bowlers of express pace. So this is, yeah, as you say, very much going back to something that worked, at the start of the 70s, and I suppose the great West Indies teams of the 80s and early 90s would go with pace. So I think it's probably the right strategy. I mean, we'll know, as ever at the end of it, if it's worked, it's the right strategy. If it hasn't, it's not. But certainly those first two tests at Perth, the Optus Stadium in Perth, and the Gabba are quick, bouncy pitches, or they were last year. So I kind of agree with what Stuart Broad said on this. England have got to hit them with pace at the start, assuming everybody is fit. Probably that would mean gambling on Archer and Wood together. I'd probably go Archer, Wood, Atkinson, obviously Stokes. And then in terms of the spinner, whether you need one or you possibly even go for Will Jacks to extend the batting and just give you a bit of an option if you need it, but kind of thinking that you hopefully won't need very much of it.
Yeah.
But that would give you a long batting lineup.
And in fact, what the point you made about the spinner is very interesting, because Graham Swan, certainly one of the most successful England spinners I've ever seen, including in Australia, he
Mm.
intimated that Shoaib Bashir might be required to perform a holding role rather than
Mm.
be a strike bowler. Would you say that that was a fair description? So almost like Ashley Giles in England in 2005. He wasn't really a strike bowler. He did a holding job and allowed rotation of the quicker bowlers at the other end. Is that his role?
Well, I think it probably is because history tells you that visiting spinners, don't really win series in Australia. And I suppose you then come to the thing of thinking, can we afford a player in Bashir who, can't really bat, isn't a great fielder? Is it a bit of a luxury having a bowler like that in the team? I think he is a talented bowler. I like that he's tall, he bowls from a high release point, he gets bounce. I think all of that's really positive. But I wonder in those first two tests if they will go either with no spinner or the Will Jacks option. Because also, if you've got an aging Australian bowling attack, you've already
Yep,
got the
we'll get to
injury
that.
to Pat Cummings. Is it worth actually extending the batting to try and get some overs into their legs and just keep them out there, which I know is contrary to the Bazball get in and have a bit of a hit kind of approach. But actually, with these matches coming sort of thick and fast one after the next, you actually want to get these guys a little bit tired. So I would probably go with that on the basis of having not seen the pitch and only read kind of what everybody else has read.
It would be fair to say, by reputation, the Optus Stadium in Perth. I
Mm,
mean, not to be confused with the WACA, where the Western Australian
indeed.
team are playing their first class games, but it is in Perth nonetheless. But by reputation, the Optus and Brisbane are going to be the quickest surfaces that England are likely to bowl on. So, with that in mind, would you try to get Archer and Wood through Perth and Brisbane, and then rest and rotate them thereafter, and maybe bring in Bashir for those other three test matches?
Probably. I mean, I think they may be reluctant to do that because of how quickly. I think the first test finishes 25th of November, and you've got the second starting. You have actually got a bit of a break. The second starts, I think, December the 4th. So you have got a bit of a break there. It's not as
Yeah,
if it's a sort of 2-day turnaround or whatever.
that's what I was thinking.
Maybe they do need to do that. I don't think there's any point saving your best bowlers for, the third or fourth test because history tells you if we've tried. You remember the last time we were there, and I don't know who came up with that crazy idea of you got the two best or most successful bowlers in England's history, or two of the most successful in Anderson and Broad. Let's not play them in the first test. I mean, utterly bizarre. I don't know who came up with that, and saving them for a day nighter. I just think you got to, especially against Australia, especially in their own backyard, you've got to hit them. It's always that thing of do what the opposition least wants you to do. And
Okay.
who would Australia least want to face? Probably Wood and Archer pinging them down
Oh,
at
yeah.
90 miles an hour.
If you're bowling at that pace, you've got a reaction time of about half a second. something like that from the moment the ball leaves a bowler's hand, and assistance from the pitch.
Yeah, and what I keep reading is that the approach against Steve Smith, who obviously is the linchpin of their batting, is going to be not quite body line, but firing it in short, trying to make him uncomfortable. I was interested in the current Sheffield Shield game, which I was been watching some highlights of that, and I think he got 50 odd in each innings, but he was out playing this really awkward sort of half hook, half pull, half I'm not sure quite just what sort of shot.
Mm.
And that may be a bit of a signal for England that actually they're not in the first flush of youth, these guys.
Well,
So,
that's true, and we're going to
you
get to
know,
that. So let's have a look at the England batting, and then we're going to get
mm,
on to
mm.
the well-seasoned. That would be the polite way of putting it.
That's a
A
polite way of
great
putting it.
and a
Very good.
well-seasoned Australian bowling attack. We know Joe Root. He doesn't have a terrible record in Australia. He averages in the mid
Mm,
30s. He's scored 9 half centuries in 14 games, which is not a bad return.
mm.
But he hasn't got a century. What do you think it's going to be different this time without the burden of captaincy?
Well, I do hope so because, of course, Matthew Hayden has threatened to run naked around the MCG if he doesn't get 100. So I think, for all of our sakes, we do not want that while we're munching on our Christmas pudding a month or so's time.
I think that's probably one
Um,
area where England and Australia would be in agreement,
in
actually.
total agreement. They'll just sort of give him, just let him get to 100. Clearly, he has found it more difficult there than other countries. It's that sort of dab shot that he does down to third man, which works really well on slower pitches, and in Australia with the bounce tends to fly off to the slips
Yeah.
sometimes. I mean, that's slightly simplistic because, as you say, it's not like he averages, 5 or 10. He still averages nearly 40, and he's got lots of half centuries there. And as you rightly say, he's had the burden of captaincy,
On two of the
which
tours.
on two of the tours, one of
Yeah.
them was the COVID one, which must have been awful
Yeah.
to try and sort of navigate your way through that. Stuart Broad, I think, said we should discount that from the record, but anyway, maybe that's a bit extreme.
Probably
But
not going to happen. Yeah.
I would be surprised if he doesn't get 100 this time
Yeah.
somewhere. I'm not going to threaten to do something akin to what Matthew Hayden said if he doesn't, but
Well, we'll have to make
I
this a radio
well,
podcast.
indeed. Nobody needs to see that anyway. But there's no. He's in the form of his life. It's him and Brooke that are the top two
Yeah.
on the rankings. So I think he's a better player now than he was 4 years ago. I think
Yeah,
that's fair to
probably.
say. I think he's more hungry than he was 4 years ago, and this is certainly his last Ashes tour
Yes.
away. Whether he's still around for the home series in a couple of years' time, we'll have to see. But it's certainly his last Ashes tour away. So I would be surprised if he doesn't.
I think his
Um,
contribution is absolutely vital. Of course, you've got Ben Stokes, who has scored a century in Australia, albeit a long time ago, on his first tour as a fresh-faced 22-year-old on quite a broken, uneven pitch, as I remember.
mm, mm.
So, how do you think he'll go as a batter? And who do you think might be the surprise package, either for good reasons or bad reasons, from an England point of view?
And I think Harry Brook will do well, but then that shouldn't be a surprise because I think he averages 80 in overseas test matches. I mean, I know he had a good record, but that amazed me, that stat, averaging 80, and he's done probably 3 or 4 tours now. So
Yes.
that's over quite a long period of time, that record. I think Zach Crawley may be a surprise on the upside. He gets a lot of flack. He flashes to slip. He's got no ability to construct an innings. It's bish bash bosh, and frequently it fails. The pitches will suit him there. So I think he could well be a surprise on the upside. And then, of course, we've got this debate about number three. Where where
Yeah,
where are
Pope or
you with
Bethel.
that? The Pope or Bethel thing? What do you think on that?
I take a slightly old-fashioned view on that. I think the person in possession has to be given a fair wind. I
Mm.
think bringing Bethel in as they did in the Oval Test match towards the end of the English summer against India, he hadn't had any first-class cricket behind him in the past month before he'd done that, and expecting a young bloke, a very talented young bloke, but a young bloke with almost no cricket behind him that summer to face an absolutely rampant Mohammad Siraj. I thought he was magnificent, and I think that was
Mm.
asking a heck of a lot, and it showed.
It was almost as if it was me batting out there. He looked like he'd
Yeah,
never held a bat in his life. I mean, he hadn't played in ages. He'd been sort of carted around carrying the
yeah,
drinks. I guess he had an opportunity in the recent New Zealand ODI matches, if he'd have come into those and looked really good and positive and got a couple of scores or whatever, then he would be kind of forcing his way in. But other than that, you're just picking on a hunch, really. I'm inclined to agree, really, that the guy in possession, he's not done amazingly well, but he's not done terribly either, Ollie
He
Pope.
does
And they
tend to
kind
do
of
quite well in first test matches, doesn't
he
he?
does, yeah. Well, a bit like England. He starts well, and then he tends to kind of fade towards the end. So I
Mm.
kind of think they've got to go with him. I mean, I do feel quite sorry for the rest of the batting lineup because he's not someone, bless him, that when he comes in those first 10 balls, it's genuinely terrifying. But, he's the player that he is, and they've kind of got to find out now once and for all, is he going to really make it as a
Yeah.
test match batsman, batter, or not really?
I think that gives us a reasonable idea of what the England team is going to look like. Perhaps broadly similar to the England team that played against India at the Oval in the last Test match, with a slightly rejigged bowling attack, at least for the first Test match, possibly the first two, to accommodate
And
Jofra
obviously,
Archer
and
and
just
Mark
one
Wood.
other thing. I mean, you've obviously got a long batting lineup. Whether they pick Will Jacks or they go with Bashir, you've got
Mm.
Smith at 7 as the keeper batsman, a really, really good player. I think he'll be a surprise on the upside as well, actually,
Yeah,
particularly if we can get reasonable starts and he can come in, at 250 for 5 or something,
yeah.
and then bash a quick 60, 70. So I think he'll be
Yeah.
he'll be a surprise on the upside. But yeah, I think the batting lineup is pretty good. Shoot me when they're 100 for 8 in 10 days time.
Right, we'd better get
Anyway.
on to Australia. Unquestionably a great bowling attack. I mean, of all the Australian bowling attacks I've seen, I can only really think of the Australian bowling attack of 2001, where you had a young Jason Gillespie sharing the ball with Glenn McGrath. Brett Lee was available. Shane Warne was still at or near his peak. It's the only bowling attack I can think of that is better than an attack that comprises of Cummins, Hazelwood, Stark. But we know that Cummins is out, at least for the first Test
Mhm.
match. We know it's quite an old bowling attack, and we know that we're
Mm.
playing 5 Test matches in 6 weeks. And actually, one of the bowling reserves, Sean Abbott, is injured, so we know
Mhm.
he won't play at the Optus ground either. So, how do you think Australia are going to manage their bowlers in what is quite a packed Ashes series?
That's going to be key, I think, to how the series goes. Their bowlers, as you say, have been completely magnificent in recent years and really going back a decade or so. I was reading that these guys have got over 700 Test wickets in their home conditions, compared to England's bowling attack, who got 43. So there's a massive difference in experience in those conditions. And obviously, in the recent series that Australia played in the West Indies, where they managed to win all 3 tests, but their batting was absolutely hopeless. I know the pitches were spicy and difficult, but it was the bowlers getting them out of trouble time and again. I think Stark and Hazelwood both averaged around 14 per wicket or something completely
Yeah.
ludicrous. And England's approach, I don't know what you think on this, whether they try and go for a sort of Bazball approach, especially against someone like Scott Boland. Do you try and really, literally and figuratively, get on the front foot, try and smack him out of the attack a bit, or do you try and grind them down, particularly in those first 20 overs, on the basis that it should get easier, further into the innings as the ball gets older, and thinking they're an aging attack, and you want to get miles in their legs? I don't know. I mean, I think probably England fans greedily will say, let's do both. Let's score at 5 or 6 and over, and let's bat for 120 overs, and it would be wonderful. I'm not sure. It'd be interesting to see what their approach is.
We know Boland is going to play in the first Test match. His record in Australia and his record this season is
Mm,
magnificent. He's not as quick as Mitchell Stark, but he's very accurate. So there may be some logic in running at him, as you say, but I think it's risky because he's not going to miss the stumps an awful lot,
mm.
and and he's not going to miss the body an awful lot if he's inclined either. What about the spin bowling? Do you see Nathan Lyon playing all 5 and doing a holding role on pitches that don't suit him?
I'm not sure. I was listening to something Mark Taylor was saying yesterday. He was saying, don't be surprised if Lyon doesn't play certainly the first test and possibly the first 2, and that they go for a pace attack. He actually disagrees with that. He thinks Lyon should play or five. I kind of think against England, we have had historically so many problems against spin in any conditions, and I think they've got a good enough pace attack, three quicks, Lyon, and then of course you come on to this thing of who the fifth bowler is to Cam Green. He is back bowling,
Yes, he is.
having had an injury. Do they slot him in at six as the fifth bowler? Or do they play him as they did in the Caribbean, play him at three, move Labuschagne up to open with Khawaja, Cam Green at three, possibly not bowling, and then have Bo Webster at six, who just got, I think, 5 wickets the other day. But I think either which way, they're going to have an attack of five. I mean, I think you need to, when you've got an ageing attack, you need five bowlers just to have a bit of an insurance policy if somebody does break down or you need a bit of a rotation.
They've still got Brendan Doggett in reserve, who is fit
Yeah,
and could potentially come in for the second game if Cummins isn't ready or if there's a problem elsewhere in the
yeah.
attack. Let's have a look at the batting because now Travis had a wonderful test record in the last year or so, but he hasn't done particularly well in
No,
first
he
class.
failed again last night, I think, and is not in
Whereas
great form at the
Labuschagne
minute.
is the other way around. Not particularly outstanding test record in last year, but his record, his first class form this Australian summer is absolutely magnificent. So how do you see those two going?
Well, I think Travis Head will do well. He's a really, really good player. Labuschagne, they've got this decision to make. Do you move him? Do you leave him at three? He didn't play in the West Indies, but Cam Green didn't do that well there. So do you put Labuschagne in his position where he's? I think all of his Test hundreds have come at three. So do you play him there? Play Weatherald as the debut opener with Khawaja, Smith at four, Head at five, and then Green or Webster at six? Or do you move Labuschagne up to open? I don't know who you then put in at three, whether you leave Cameron Green there. I don't think they'll want to mess up the Smith Travers Head at 4 and 5 thing. I think they'll want Smith at four. I think a bit like England with Joe Root not wanting him at three. It'll be really interesting to see which way they decide to go. I think moving Labuschagne up to open with Khawaja, you do run the risk of from their point of view of they may well grind England down, but they'll do it incredibly slowly, and
Yeah.
actually that's not putting pressure back onto the England bowlers.
So possibly you open with Weatherald, who is a more aggressive player,
Yeah, I've not seen a
and then
lot of
bring
him, but from what
Labuschagne.
I've read and the bit I have seen, he is quite attacking. Although the other thing is, do you want two left-handers? Jofra Archer has a very good record against left-handers. I kind of think whichever way they go, that there's positives and negatives for both sides. I think if they go with Weatherald, England have got the double left-hander thing. If they
Yeah.
go with Labuschagne, it's quite a slow, stodgy start potentially, and England can exploit that. So I
Mm.
think any which way, the top order is an area that England will look to and say we can put some early pressure on these guys. This is not the era of sort of Hayden and Langer or
No.
Taylor and Slater.
Do you think Australia have gone a little too conservative? I mean, there has been some criticism in some quarters, including from the great Steve Waugh, saying that they could
Mm.
have made bold choices and haven't.
I think he was quite critical of George Bailey, wasn't he? And I
Yes.
think Greg Chappell said much the same thing, that they should have gone with a slightly more adventurous selection. But then it's hard because if you've got a team that's basically been very successful, and I think back to sort of the West Indies at the end of the 80s, early 90s. I know it's a long time ago, but when you're winning every series you play, what's the justification for moving people on apart from purely on grounds of age? But I do get why, as a selector, it's difficult to make that call. Because
Oh,
what
it
do you
is.
ring the
It's
player
never
up and say,
easy.
I'm dropping you, I'm dropping you because you're too old? I mean, that's
No.
not, A, that's not nice, and B, it's just not, it doesn't make sense in terms of, your job as a selector, as I see it, is to pick teams to win test matches. Um,
Intuitively, you could argue that it's easier to bring a young and untested player into a side that's winning than it is
mm,
to bring a player into a completely revamped side that's not winning. You could
mm,
argue they've tried to do this earlier with Nathan McSweeney and Sam Constance, and it hasn't really
mhm.
worked out. So they've gone for a bit more of a conservative approach for this. So maybe you could argue they've tried to bring young players in and it hasn't worked out, and they've decided to go down a little more of a conservative route.
Well, I certainly think with the top order batting, I mean, it just wasn't working out at all. I mean, Constas with the weird sort of flaps and reverse, I don't know what you'd call it, reverse scoopy things. He just looked like he was a sort of pale imitation of Bazball, and you kind of think that wasn't going to cut it. But I can see why they've done it, because ultimately they're trying to protect a very strong middle order. So you've got Usman Khawaja, who I think turns 39 in this
Yeah.
series. So again, not in the first flush of youth in cricketing standards, and hasn't looked at his best against raw pace in recent times. There are definitely vulnerabilities there.
Yeah,
The interesting
absolutely.
thing for them will be if the top order fails and say England did win the first test, will they then panic and rejig things?
We're on the half hour now, so I'm going to ask you, if you don't mind, to wrap up with a very quick and very daring prediction as to where you think the first test will go.
I've got to go with England. I mean,
Yeah,
we haven't won the first test of an Ashes series since 86-7. Even 2010-11 when they won the series, halfway through the match, it looked quite ropey from an England point of view, and it was only Cook and Trott batting for what felt like weeks and weeks and weeks that saved the game comfortably. So we don't have a great record in first tests in Australia. There's been lots of talk about this preparation, where they're just having one 3-day game basically against themselves or against the Lions team. But in a way, I kind of think, well, we've tried other approaches and they haven't worked. So I kind of have some respect for Stokes and England for saying, actually, it's a congested fixture list. We don't want our bowlers getting injured in sort of unimportant warm-up games. So we're going to go with what we think and what has worked for us basically in every series abroad that we've played. In recent years, where we've won the first test with minimal preparation. So I think England will win, is my prediction.
good.
Yes.
Well, on that note, I'm just going to introduce the cocktail. I can't claim total credit for it, so I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Mrs. Beeton. It's a Victorian recipe book. I've picked a Theakston's Old Peculiar, although it's actually a Theakston's Nout Peculiar, because it hasn't got any alcohol in, and it was brewed in North Yorkshire, so you can see the connection there. And you heat that up to just not quite at boiling point, and you add some cloves and ginger, nutmeg, and sugar to taste. So I'm just going to have
There
a
we
quick taste of
go.
that now.
So it's a mocktail,
It's
essentially.
a hot punch mocktail. Yeah, needs more sugar, but I'll give it another go, and I'll introduce a totally different cocktail after the first test match. So thank you very much, Alan. We'll reconvene
Cool.
after the Optus Stadium.
And we'll be talking about what a great victory it was and how we were completely right in our predictions.
That then it would make my next conversation with my Australian
I
cousins
hope.
so much easier. Thank you very much, Alan. Bye
See
for
you
now.
again. Take
Take
care.
care. So there you have it, a bold prediction from Alan Bone there about England's chances in the first Test match, and that match starts at 2 a.m. UK time on Friday morning. This probably is Joe Root's last Test series in Australia, and as Alan pointed out, the consequences of Joe Root not scoring a century in this Ashes series are as problematic for the Australian public, at the Melbourne Cricket Ground at any rate, as it could be for England, albeit for not the same reasons. We'll be back after the conclusion of the first Test match for our first series review, and in the meantime I welcome any comments you have. More cricket and more cocktails to come, but for now, goodbye.